think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
In this episode, I will talk about a very frightening confrontation I had with a spirit years ago. It was the first negative experience I had with a spirit since I had begun communicating with them. Years and years ago, when I was ignorant and foolish enough to use a Ouija board to communicate with spirits, I had unwittingly attracted the attention of a very strange type of spirit being. I wasn't aware of the presence of this being for a while, as I mistook it for the spirits which I had previously established contact with before using the board. It requested that I leave out certain items on a small end table, like a sort of makeshift altar. It requested a small amount of wine, a small butt of marijuana, and a cigarette. For quite a long time, I thought it was one of my other spirits asking for these same things, and it seemed rather strange to me. One time, when I was asking my spirits which images in the room they could associate themselves with, this being first came to my attention as being something separate from the others. It selected an image of the planet Earth covered in a grid which contained the faces of many screaming infants. It was quite unsettling, as my other spirits had indicated images of human people. When I would ask for this being's name via automatic writing, it would write out gibberish, which was different every time, whereas my other spirits would easily spell things out intelligibly. When I interrogated the being over why it couldn't spell out a name, it told me that it was because it didn't have one. It was also lacking a face and an identity. That should have been my first red flag, but what was I supposed to do? I didn't know how to banish a spirit being at that point, and it was long before I had amassed a large group of helpful spirits and gods which would never have allowed such a being to get anywhere near me. Something which I had previously mentioned on this podcast is that it once tried to tell me that it was an Enochian angel of the apocalypse. I didn't believe it for a second, though I didn't voice my doubt. Summoning an Enochian angel is an extremely difficult, dangerous, and high-level act of Western magic. Certainly one of them wouldn't just casually stroll into the life of an ignorant fool messing around with an Ouija board. When I asked my guide about this troubling entity, he told me that it was a type of being which has absolutely no identity. Around this time, I found myself sinking into an incredibly deep melancholy. It was more horribly painful than any sadness I'd ever felt before in my life. It was a yearning so deep and profound that it was crippling. I later found out that this horrible melancholy was caused by me empathically feeling this being's terrible, pitiable state of existence. Eventually, my experiences with this being reached a boiling point. I had a printout of a piece of sacred geometry on my wall. It was created by magicians John Dee, a cult advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and Edward Kelly in the 1500s. Sometimes I would perceive energy of some sort coming out of it. I would then reach my hands out and pull at the energy, and it would float slowly out of the wall in globular masses which looked very similar to the wax in a lava lamp. While I was doing this one night, I felt that nameless entity arrive and begin feeding on the globs of energy I was pulling out of the symbol on the wall. After a while, when I decided that I wanted to do something else, I felt the being grab my head and press on it very hard. I asked it if it intended to hurt me, and it pushed my head up and down like I was nodding yes. To say no, it would shake my head back and forth. When I questioned it some more, it told me that it was furious with me for ceasing to pull energy out of the symbol. I tore the symbol off the wall, tore it into pieces, set those pieces on fire, and flushed the ashes down the toilet. Mr. No Name was furious. My spirit guide then pulled me to a septagram which was created by infamous rocket scientist and practicing warlock Jack Parsons. He began pulling some kind of energy out of that symbol to push No Name off of me. I could physically feel the thing barely holding on to me by pinching down on my left ear. I began to seriously panic at this point. I didn't know what to do. I was woefully ignorant of magical techniques and knowledge at the time. I mean, who could I go to help me get rid of this thing if I couldn't do it myself? A priest? I'm not going to trust a Catholic priest. Some kind of New Age healer? Most of them are frauds, and how can I afford to find one who isn't? A shaman? I can't afford a plane ticket to the goddamned Amazon. What the hell would I do? I collected myself, pushed away the rising tide of panic, and decided to change my strategy. Perhaps my mentality of trying to fight the thing off of me was a perspective programmed into me by my Hollywood-informed modern Western upbringing. This was magic, after all. It was breaking all the rules of that perceived world, defying all which that narrow, materialistic viewpoint erroneously calls logic and rationality. The world outside and all its programming should hold no sway here. So why should I listen to my programmed-in reactions? I decided to sit Mr. No Name down and have a talk with it. I asked it if it wanted anyone to like it. It said yes. I asked it if it wanted other people to want to be around it. It said yes. I asked it if it wanted me to like it. It answered yes again. I explained to it calmly and reasonably that grabbing someone's head and trying to crush it is completely and utterly the wrong course of action to take if you want other people to like you. It backed off with its attack, but I still had a headache and felt lesser sensations on my head for quite a while. Fortunately, the next day, I took a 2-week-long trip out of state to visit family for the holidays, and when I returned, to my relief, Mr. No Name was gone. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
In Ontario, a man with a reported history of UFO sightings says he encountered a flying snake-like creature in the woods of Prince Edward County. Paul Shishis, a 56-year-old working as a QC receiver, told Cryptozoology News the encounter took place while camping near Sandbanks Provincial Park in proximity to Lake Ontario. I was at camp preparing to take a shower and then head back to the tent for sleep, he said about the 2003 incident. I was alone at the back of the building where the showers are located. There was a single bright light on a pole for light, he added. Shishis says that as he lit a cigarette, he noticed a 3-foot-long creature hovering about 6 feet off the ground making a fan-like noise as if its body was rotating. It made a figure 8, then returned back the way it came. The Canadian, who says he was in a state of shock at the time, explains the creature came back about 40 seconds later. I was so freaked out that I went into the shower stall. I began taking a shower and tried to calm down, he said. Reportedly, after a 15-minute shower, the eyewitness went back to his tent in an attempt to sleep. He described the creature as a flying snake-like being with a grayish-white body. Its face contained 2 large dark eyes like a goose at the front. The creature's eyes rolled back as it passed me. Its body was like a broom handle stick. Girth of the body was about 4 to 5 inches in diameter. The man says he didn't notice anything like wings on the sides of the body, although something very similar, white and brilliant, was attached to its back. It was spinning like a fan, he explained. No other witnesses were present during his alleged encounter with the creature. But according to Shishis, this aerial anomaly is not the only one he has experienced throughout his life. Well known among the UFO community, the man claims to have witnessed over 400 UFOs. Some very bizarre, sizes ranging from basketball to miles, he says about the flying objects. They are solid, then translucent, pure light, appear and disappear. He tells Cryptozoology News that, as a young child, he went through an experience that leads him to believe he was abducted by the occupants of these unidentified vehicles. That discovery happened in 2003, and it was not nightmares, he said. Shishis, who went public in 2005, believes the sightings might be linked to the Marysburg Vortex, an area in eastern Lake Ontario known for reports of strange occurrences that some have compared to the Bermuda Triangle. As to what the creature really was, the Canadian says it was probably some sort of interdimensional being. I have experienced extraordinary unknown aerial anomalies. I have also been trailed by unmarked black helicopters, Shishi said. I felt it my duty to share these experiences with my human family. In Long Prairie, Minnesota, on October 23, 1965 at about 7:40 p.m., Jerry Townsend, a rookie radio announcer, was about 4 miles out of Long Prairie when he rounded a curve into the twilight zone. Suddenly his engine, radio, and lights went dead. As he braked to a stop, he saw just ahead of him in the middle of the road a rocket-shaped object resting on 3 fins. The rocket stood about 30 to 40 feet high and measured about 10 feet wide. Townsend got out of the car and saw 3 little beer can-shaped robots coming toward him from under the rocket. Each robot was only about 6 inches tall and waddled side to side on a pair of fins. When they stopped, a third fin, like a stabilizer, came down in the rear. Though the robots had no faces as such, Townsend got the impression that they were watching him. After what seemed to Townsend like an eternity, the tiny robots returned to the craft and disappeared into it. When the rocket took off, it looked to him like someone was lifting a flashlight off a table. Townsend drove straight to the sheriff's office and recounted his experience. The sheriff found Townsend visibly frightened and reported that the witness was not a drinker and that he enjoyed a good reputation in town. A police investigation of the site uncovered 3 parallel strips of an oil-like substance on the road about 4 inches apart and 3 feet long, the likes of which the police had never seen before on the road. 2 hunters also came forward and seemed to at least partially corroborate Townsend's account, attesting that they had seen a bright object rise up from the area at the time of the incident. On October 6, 1954, at dusk, in Mouchamp, France, Mr. and Mrs. Laroche from Paris saw a fiery sphere landing near Chantenay. On October 6, 1954, at 21:30 hours, in La Ferraille, France, near the military barracks, soldiers saw a strange object on the ground 300 meters away. As one of them approached the torpedo-shaped object, which was about 80 centimeters high, he found himself paralyzed. On October 6, 1954, at 22:30 hours, in Villers-les-Lacs, France, 2 women, Mrs. Salabrino and her daughter, saw a whitish light in the western sky. It seemed slowly to come toward the ground, and was later seen between the railroad station and the bridge 100 meters away from their house. When it moved, a very bright light was visible under its dark mass. It gave off a flow of sparks and rose, hovered for a moment, and flew away rapidly. On October 7, 1954, in Hennezys, France, 2 Lancelin children witnessed the landing of a luminous red object shaped like a half egg and saw 2 occupants who looked like normal men. On October 7th, 1954, early in the day, in Plozeve, France, the crew of several fishing boats saw a luminous orange-colored object over the coast, apparently surrounded by dense smoke. Villagers saw the same object and stated independently that it came within 10 meters of the ground, then flew away to the southeast. On October 7th, 1954, at 0400 hours, in Bourgogne, France, a farmer, Mr. Thibault, saw a luminous object 2 or 3 meters in diameter, emitting a beam of light which swept the countryside. In Jettingen, France, a railroad employee, René Ott, saw a mushroom-shaped object 3 meters in diameter in a field 3 meters away from Route N16 and 1 meter above the ground. A luminous rectangle like a door was seen on the side. It took off and flew about 5 meters above the witness, following him to the next village. Now returning to some more strange events in Italy. Off Savona, UFO emerged from sea, 3rd June 1961. Near Syracuse, Sicily, 11-foot reptile seen hunted for 2 days, then found and killed by peasants, carcass burned, December 1933. Italian jeweler and his wife, traveling in car at night, saw in headlight beams a little entity 3.5 feet tall in luminous or iridescent garment, diving helmet, and 2 little wings instead of arms, 19th May 1960. At River Ticino, water monster seen at Rivermouth, 1934. In Torriglia, near Genoa, night watchman Fortunato Zanfretta saw a 9-foot entity in UFO and had time-lapse. He had another encounter later in the month when he went missing, and under hypnosis recalled being taken aboard the UFO, 6th and the 27th of December 1978, with further experiences on the 30th of July and the 2nd of December 1979. In Turin, poltergeist outbreak in inn cellar where bottles fell and broke, 16th November to 7th December 1900. Luminous, pulsating, colorful ball of light seen in sky above Castel Airport. This UFO moved fast and performed maneuvers impossible for a plane, 30th November 1973. Near Undine, several people saw a giant serpent 12 feet long which made whistling noise, summer 1963. At Venus Lake, at island of Pantelleria, noises heard in lake at night, leading to rumors of lake monster, July 1982. Near Villa Sentina, in Cardia, Friuli, Professor R. J. Johannes, searching for fossils in the mountains, saw landed UFO and 2 small entities with green skin, large round eyes, and a slit mouth. When he shouted to them, one sent a ray of smoke from his belt and witness fell to ground. They took his pick and left in UFO, 14th August 1947. Now at the Ivory Coast, at Oboro, Abidjan, blood spurted from house walls, 12th March 1985. In Adeopoldome, near Abidjan, African boy saw a pygmy covered with long reddish fur and long reddish head hair who ran into forest, 1947. There are other similar reports, including one of a creature being killed between Sassandra and Cavally rivers by elephant hunter, 1947. And in Jamaica and Roehampton, there was a poltergeist outbreak going from May to July 1931.
What the hell in God's name is going down?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
I'm going to read some selections from the book Cosmic Voyage by Courtney Brown, PhD. First one is called A Brief History of the U.S. Military Psychic Warfare Program. This is a book about 2 extraterrestrial civilizations that either already have or soon will have an important evolutionary impact on human life on Earth. This is not a book about scientific remote viewing. Nonetheless, since scientific remote viewing has been used to obtain the data presented here, and since it is a new science, it is necessary to briefly outline the history of the subject so that readers can place the techniques used in this research into a proper context. The U.S. government's involvement with psychic matters was born of the need to collect information about the country's enemies. Initial interest originated within the CIA in the 1970s, but the bulk of the research was conducted by U.S. Army intelligence, beginning with a highly secret project aimed at training some of their best officers. The critical problem with military intelligence collection has always been the risk faced by its agents, often caused by the difficulty of communicating information back to headquarters. Technological devices, no matter how cleverly they were concealed, could still be discovered, and the agent's life and information jeopardized. What was needed was a means of communicating information to Washington, D.C. without any physical apparatus. The original idea was for the military to develop some type of psychic switch that could be activated in the Pentagon from, say, Moscow. The agent could be assigned the task of getting some crucial information that would have a yes or no informational response to it. For example, the U.S. military could be interested in whether or not the Soviets had a new type of weapon. A spy tasked with acquiring this information could productively use such a psychic switch. Even if the spy was under surveillance by the KGB, it would never be obvious that he or she was transmitting data. The U.S. military was also concerned that the Soviets might be developing a psychic military potential. The United States did not want to be left behind and a psychic Cold War developed. Interestingly, the Soviets actually did have a psychic warfare program. Their approach was to screen their population for the best possible natural psychics, rather than to attempt to create a training program. While they did manage to assemble an effective psychic team, the Soviet efforts were hampered by the same problem that plagued the US efforts, namely, resistance from high levels of command. On both sides, some of the resistance was aimed at preventing a focus on particular unwanted targets such as UFOs, but sometimes the resistance was much more general to the nature of the data collection method itself. Many commanding officers on both the US and Soviet sides subscribe to conservative or traditional belief systems, often religious in nature. Even the non-religious objections made it clear that many people did not want to acknowledge the capabilities of such techniques. The resistance extended beyond the military. Indeed, I was told of one instance in which a very high-ranking civilian political appointee serving directly under the Secretary of Defense began to object strenuously during a top-secret briefing on the subject of UFOs when the matters of alien technology and psychic information were raised. The official asserted that this information was not supposed to be known by any humans until we die and learned it from heavenly sources. Apparently, the Soviet situation was no better. Their officials were spooked by the subject as well, and their project remained underfunded. The CIA's initial involvement with psychic matters began by working with natural psychics. When the CIA's covert mining of Nicaraguan harbors came to the attention of Congress, the CIA purged all units and projects that could lead to further political trouble or embarrassment. This ended the CIA's involvement with psychic warfare. The program to develop a psychic switch never succeeded, but the effort to do so resulted in the military's exploration of the application of psychic techniques in intelligence gathering. Two projects are particularly noteworthy in this regard. The first was the work of Professor Robert Jan of Princeton University's PAIR, or Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, which attracted a great deal of interest from the intelligence community, though the PAIR lab received no military intelligence funding. However, it was the research at the Remote Viewing Lab at SRI International, formerly the Stanford Research Institute, under the leadership of Dr. Harold Putoff, that attracted the military's interest most. The U.S. Army did not have the same political problems that plagued the CIA. To the Army, mission accomplished was the only thing that mattered. While the CIA was enmeshed in its psychic troubles, the Army began creating a group of hidden or black units that would help solve some of its more difficult intelligence problems. One of these special units was codenamed Detachment G for Grill Flame, and did not appear on any organizational schematic for the military. Detachment G was assigned the original task of investigating the use of psychic techniques to penetrate the most secret military projects of the enemies of the United States. Because of this unit's unusual nature, information it gathered was circulated only to a handful of the highest-ranking officers and political appointees. It soon became apparent that the project was yielding useful information. If the project was going to mature, it would have to be expanded beyond its existing boundaries. The problem with expanding the project was that the phenomenon of remote viewing had not been recognized by the scientific community. The Army needed to find some way to give the phenomenon greater scientific credibility so that it could eventually put its efforts on the books and increase funding. Thus, it began funding some scientific efforts in an attempt to validate the phenomenon. The early efforts at psychic information gathering did not involve remote viewing as it is practiced today. Their first efforts focused on maintaining altered states of consciousness in people who were natural psychics. Operationally, this usually involved the psychic lying on a bed with electrodes connected to his or her head and feet. The electronic equipment was used to indicate that the subject had achieved a 180-degree polarity shift in body voltage, which was usually the indication that the altered state had been achieved. Another person in the room, called a facilitator, would then instruct the person to move the target and report what he or she observed. Though these experiments yielded some useful information, the information gathered in this fashion was not always consistent across sessions or subjects. The military needed high degrees of reliability. Nothing else would do if the big brass were to be convinced of the material's value. It was in 1982 that natural psychic Ingo Swann made his major breakthroughs in remote viewing by developing the protocols that would support reliable intelligence gathering. Swann made his discoveries over many years as he was participating in extensive experiments being conducted at various scientific institutes, including Stanford Research Institute. He developed a form of remote viewing that was based on the use of geographical coordinates, and this form became known as coordinate remote viewing. Another natural psychic who has worked extensively with SRI International was Joseph McMoneagle. Mr. McMoneagle has recently published a very readable book on the subject of remote viewing. The book, Mind Trek, Exploring Consciousness, Time, and Space Through Remote Viewing, also has a chapter on some of his own viewing of a past civilization on Mars. Indeed, my own research under controlled conditions corroborates many of McMoneagle's observations regarding this ancient Martian civilization. Later, Swann was contracted to train over a dozen individuals in these techniques, some members of the military and some civilians. The original training lasted 1 year. To introduce the general subject of altered awareness to the trainees, the team was first sent to the Monroe Institute in Virginia, where they received formal training in out-of-body states. Washington, D.C. would not be itself without at least one major scandal occupying the attention of the lawmakers and the press at any given time. Every so often, but always after a major scandal, the powers that be take action to avoid such incidents in the future. During the Iran-Nicaragua Oliver North fiasco, the Secretary of Defense initiated a search throughout the defense community for any other rogue or hip pocket organizations lacking proper oversight, which might prove politically embarrassing to the president. He found the remote viewing detachment and sent an inspector general team to investigate it. Since the remote viewing team was supposed to be a research unit, the civilian overseers presented the research they thought could be defended as normal. Operational matters went from bad to worse from that point on for the nation's most highly trained remote viewers. Their influence in Washington, never great, diminished. Yet all of the team members knew by this time that they had been given a special gift, a gift of sight. This gift brought with it a responsibility that extended beyond national boundaries. It was this realization, together with a parallel and newly born need to serve a greater cause, that beckoned some of them to turn their inner eye upward toward the stars. When this all began in the early 1980s, none of them ever could have guessed that their gaze would eventually lead to a mission that could alter the evolutionary course of humanity itself. The next section I'm going to read is called Biases in the Extant UFO Literature. When compared with what we know about extraterrestrial activities on or near Earth, the extant literature on UFOs has many scientifically unsupported biases. However, many of the faulty conclusions that one finds in the literature are not due to incompetence. While conducting the research presented in this book, I have both spoken to and read many books by intelligent people who are sincerely trying to unravel an extremely perplexing problem. The UFO enigma is difficult to understand even with remote viewing data. In the absence of these data, it is almost impossible to fathom. The only other publicly available sources of information are based on either eyewitness accounts of passing UFOs, abduction reports, usually extracted from hypnotized individuals, or channeled information in which friendly ETs purportedly speak to supportive humans while the humans are in a trance-like state. There are problems with all of these latter types of data, and it is important to explain these problems clearly. To begin with, eyewitness reports of passing UFOs, these reports simply do not contain a sufficient amount of information to be useful from a scientific perspective. What can one say about such a report except that an unusual flying object was sighted? We are still left with no information regarding the occupants of the craft, nor do we know anything about the societies from which they originate. Problems associated with abduction reports are much more complicated and require more extended treatment. I have no doubt that something very real is happening to many people who claim to have been abducted by ETs and brought aboard a UFO, and we now have remote viewing data corroborating much of what has been reported. The general idea in these reports is that humans are being abducted and used against their will to act as incubators during the first 3 months of pregnancy for genetically engineered offspring that are part ET and part human. The literature tends to suggest that the Greys have a need to produce a new type of body for themselves in the sense that they are unsatisfied with their current biology. The vast majority of the abduction cases involve some degree of amnesia on the part of the abductee that is overcome using hypnosis by a trained therapist. 2 systematic and useful reports of this phenomenon presented by academics can be found in Abduction by Harvard University professor John E. Mack, 1994, and Secret Life, first-hand documented accounts of UFO abductions by Temple University professor David Jacobs, 1992. Dr. Mack, a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, has suggested, based on population surveys, that more than 1 million Americans may have been abducted at least once during their lives. And such experiences are not limited to people of the United States. Some individuals seek help, usually in the form of psychological counseling, to deal with the emotional impact, though the number of these individuals is relatively small. Even so, I have been told that informational reports of some therapists suggest that approximately 40,000 individuals in the United States to date may have sought some form of professional help with regard to their abduction experiences. I do not know if this is an accurate estimate. It is quite possible, perhaps likely, that the people who do go to counselors are primarily those who are particularly disturbed by their encounters with the ETs. This could be because some of the ET-human interactions do not go smoothly, whereas most other interactions are not as traumatic, for whatever reason. If this is the case, then the abduction literature is biased in terms of its sample of abductees. This is the first of 5 major biases that I find in this literature. That is, the literature is not working with a representative sample of individuals who have been abducted. On the contrary, using such a potentially unrepresentative sample would skew the results of this research in the direction of interpretations filled with fear and trauma. Predictably, much of this literature, notably excluding the work of John Mack, is filled with warnings with regard to evil aliens that are abducting adults and snatching fetuses for Nazi-like genetic experiments. The point is not whether this is true, but that it is impossible to determine the true character of the ETs based only on a lopsided selection of traumatized individuals. A more balanced selection of cases would include those in which the humans' interactions with ETs went smoothly, but such individuals would not be known to the therapists, since they would probably not seek counseling. The second major bias involved in nearly all of the abduction literature revolves around the use of hypnosis. I have no doubt that hypnosis has been very helpful in resurrecting memories for abductees. However, if the Greys have the ability to influence memory recall as profoundly as is suggested in this literature, then it is probable that the memories that are recalled are also unrepresentative. Moreover, the memories that would most likely surface are those that contain the greatest emotional impact for the abductee, such as those associated with moments of shock or trauma. Thus, we have a situation in which an unrepresentative sample of memories may be resurrected from the minds of an unrepresentative sample of abductees. It is not possible to draw general conclusions with regard to overall ET intentions from such data, even if the reported data are accurate. It would be comparable to ETs trying to find out what humans are like by interviewing only automobile accident victims. The result of any such study would inevitably be that humans are a careless, often drunk, sadistic, and evil species that enjoys inflicting suffering on their own kind. Such suffering may occur, but the characterization of that suffering as representative of the entirety of human culture would be terribly misleading. The third major bias in the abduction literature has to do with the perspective of the researchers themselves. It is easy to sympathize with individuals who feel they were kidnapped and abused. We are a highly emotional species that easily identifies with victims of traumatic events. We hate the villains and seek retribution. Researchers are in the emotional soup, so to speak, with the victims when they conduct hypnosis sessions that bring back hidden memories, and few of these researchers are trained, Mac notably excluded, to distance themselves emotionally from the lives of their subjects. Only professionals highly trained in the discipline of psychological counseling are likely to be able to work competently with such repressed memories and still remain reasonably objective. Emotions are real, and they must be worked with in the most controlled and competent environments. Minimally, the health of the patients requires this, but also, from an interpretive perspective, to draw general conclusions from data gathered by individuals who are not well trained in psychotherapeutic skills only invites serious misunderstandings of the data. The fourth bias that I find in the abduction literature involves the broader culture from which the reports originate. We are a society that loves to report violence. This is clearly evident in most of our daily television news shows. In such programs, one almost never hears about calm and emotionally healthful events. Rather, the news that dominates the airwaves is about rapes, murders, and crimes of all sorts. Victims are typically portrayed in a pathetic fashion. Rarely do news reports say anything sympathetic about a person who commits a crime, like how the person became psychologically unstable when he was sexually abused as a child, or a victim of gang rape in an alley of an inner-city slum. We rarely ask why a crime has occurred. Rather, we ask how we can punish those who commit crimes, immaturely refusing to develop a more balanced perspective of life's complexities. Additionally, our culture enjoys dwelling on the details of both imaginary and real violence. Violence is one of the most successful products of the Hollywood film industry. It permeates an enormous number of box office hits. If we ever mature as a society, one of the things that we will have to face is our love of violence. This is not to say that the abductees have not experienced things that they authentically see as personal abuse. But there may be another side to the story that we miss if we only focus on and amplify the reports of abuse while never asking if there might be a good reason for what happened. To use an analogy, just as children inevitably feel that they are assaulted when they are taken to the doctor's office to receive their vaccinations, we humans may also feel that we are abused by ETs if we do not understand the broader picture within which the activity takes place. Again, I am not minimizing the experiences of the abductees. I am just arguing for a pause in the storm of fear and hate to develop a more balanced perspective of events before we jump to conclusions and decide that we are under attack. The final bias that I find in the abduction literature is likely to be the most controversial, and some may react strongly to this idea. The bias is one of racial stereotyping. It is important to understand that I am not saying that the abductees are racist. The problem is one of how our general society tries to view beings who are different from ourselves. According to much of the abduction literature, the ETs who are involved in this activity are quite literally gray. They are small, thin, have large wraparound eyes, leathery skin, and lack emotional depth. They are not tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. Well, that's not true. Based on my research, sometimes they are. In my view, these perceived differences have triggered an automatic stereotyping to occur within our own minds with respect to these beings. If we were a society in which racism was absent, I would not raise the point here. But if we are to be honest with ourselves, we must admit that human society has a habitual problem of unfairly establishing rules of human treatment based on racial characteristics. If this is true with how we treat other humans of different races, how more so would it likely be with regard to non-humans? Abductees come from our own culture, and our own culture does not always view beings who look significantly different from ourselves in a positive light. Given such a setting, is it not surprising that such beings are often portrayed as evil? From this perspective, the potential exists for humans to contaminate the data with interpretive cultural biases. If we are to play a mature role in galactic society, we will probably need to face our own psychological problems squarely, and we'll have to learn how to view other cultures through a more objective lens.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, This House is Haunted, The Investigation into the Enfield Poltergeist by Guy Lyon Playfair. This chapter is called, Where is the Knowledge? I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Harper said to me one day. I don't think this is going to stop. It's just going to go on, and in the end we'll have to separate the children. This is my opinion. I was sure that she always was honest with me, and I was alarmed by this new feeling of resignation, which even Maurice Gross shared. It'll stop when the time comes for it to stop, he said. We've tried everything, mediums, psychologists, welfare workers, doctors, prayers, you name it. It was true that we had managed to stop the trouble temporarily on several occasions when they had been on holiday, when the children had been at the council home, after each of the medium's visits, but it had always started up again, as much as before, with furniture turning over, small objects flying about, and regular chaos in the bedroom with knocks, thuds, and the monotonous stream of abusive nonsense from the voices. Worst of all was that appearances of excrement were becoming more frequent. One day, Mrs. Harper went into the bathroom to help Jimmy with his bath. It was behind the tap, she recalled in disgust, all over the wall, and it was in the bathwater. It was just like someone scribbling. Jimmy wouldn't dare do a thing like that. but somebody was doing it. Then there were the puddles on the floor, usually in the kitchen or the lavatory. Finding an unusually large and foul-smelling puddle one day, John Burka managed to collect some of the liquid in a bottle and persuaded a colleague at the hospital where he worked to analyze it. "Are you having me on?" the colleague said later. "This is cat's piss." Both voices were now carrying on at all times of the day or night, and no longer seemed concerned whether the door was shut or if we were looking at the girls' faces as they spoke. We managed to get some good quality recordings of both Janet's and Rose's voices, using various contact microphones, and one day, while playing back one of those tapes, Gross thought there seemed to be an extra voice present. He wondered if this could be an example of a so-called Radiv voice, named after a Latvian who had apparently recorded thousands of voices supposedly of dead people on tape. A claim also made independently and previously by Fredrik Jurgensen in Sweden and Raymond Bayless in California. In January 1978, together with a visiting American researcher, Charles A. Moses, Gross decided to do a Radiv test. This is very easy. All you do is leave a tape recorder in an empty room, perform such rites as you may think appropriate, such as asking any discarnate entities around if they would care to say a few words, and then play the tape back and see what comes through. The results to aroused controversy, and I had always been somewhat skeptical ever since I had discovered that one of my tape recorders would pick up a local radio station every time I rewound the tape. Such freak radio wave reception is quite common. People hear bits of radio broadcasts coming out of their cookers, washing machines, even allegedly their own ears. Nevertheless, both Gross and I independently did record some very odd noises at Enfield. He and Moses clearly identified the word boom on their test tape, and when Gross later tried to test on his own in the empty kitchen, this is what happened. He put his machine on the table and said out loud, "If there is any entity here, will you please communicate by speaking directly into the microphone?" A few seconds later came the reply in a clear whisper, "No." I decided to repeat this experiment at once, so I took my recorder up to the back bedroom, switched it on, shut the door, and came downstairs. I stayed in the kitchen with the Harpers throughout the 20-minute test period, talking to Mrs. Harper. The children were chattering away, but I heard no voices from them. On the tape, however, I managed to pick up a quite unmistakable phrase that was one of the voice's favorites. "Here I come!" There was also a faint hello. Both utterances were considerably louder than the murmur of normal voices coming through the floorboards. I cannot be certain that I had recorded a disembodied voice, but it was certainly a most unusual sound given the circumstances. We both recorded several other unidentifiable sounds on many occasions, assorted whispers, grunts, and half-formed words. Also the intriguing clicks and swishing sound that were heard almost every time an object was thrown through the air. Despite several attempts, we never managed to repeat these sounds by throwing things ourselves. One day, Gross noticed a curious detail while Janet's voice was growling away, and not being taken much interest in by me. Her chin was well up and her neck stretched tight. "You try to imitate that noise with your neck like that," he said. I did so and could not get anywhere near it. When we imitated the voice, we found our chins automatically forced downwards and our necks contracted. We also got very sore throats in a few seconds. Yet, here were these two girls, keeping it up for hour after hour, producing the sound of an old man. We were finally able to carry out some tests using the laryngograph that Professor Hasted had managed to borrow from its designer, Professor A.J. Forshin of University College. This is an instrument with which you can study the larynx activity basic to human speech by recording patterns made by radio frequencies transmitted through the throat. We hoped this would settle the matter of at least how the voice was produced, and Professor Hasted promised to have his analysis ready for a conference to be held in Cambridge in March, at which we had been invited to hold a symposium on the Enfield case. In the meantime, there was nothing much more we could do with our voices except wish they would shut up and go away, which they did not. George Fallows of the Daily Mirror had been along to see the Harpers at Christmas to bring them some presents and see how they were getting along. He had been surprised to find how much the case had escalated and decided that his paper should do a follow-up story. Accordingly, feature writer Brian Rimmer was assigned to the story. Rimmer did a very thorough job. He went to the house several times, interviewed everybody involved at length, and took copious notes. Both Gross and I talked to him for several hours, reasoning that since he was going to do his story anyway, we might as well cooperate, especially since it had been the Mirror that had brought us in to start with. He invited me to a delicious lunch at a very exclusive little place off Fleet Street and listened to everything I had to tell him. I went back with him to his office and spent a couple more hours writing out a statement of what I had seen myself on the case. Outside his office, we met a large and heavy-set man who looked like a rugby player. Rimmer introduced him as Noel Bentley, a personal assistant to the editor. Bentley gave me a funny look, but said nothing about Enfield. A few days later, I went up to Gross's office for one of our regular discussion meetings. As soon as I arrived, I could see that something was on his mind. "Brian Rimmer just called," he said. "He says that Rose told him last night that she and Janet had been faking the voices all along just to keep the case going. What do you make of that?" Before I had time to make anything of it, the phone rang. It was Rimmer again, and he wanted my reaction to the confession. "If it's a true confession, then I'm glad you got it," I told him. "I'm interested in the truth, and if that's true, then it's useful data. Pity you got it before we did, but still. By the way, did she say how she managed to produce the voice?" "Yes, she did," Rimmer replied, "with her diaphragm." That struck me as odd. I was sure that Rose had no idea what a diaphragm was. Rimmer told me that he had taken a well-known stage ventriloquist named Ray Allen along to Enfield, together with the mysterious Mr. Bentley. Ray Allen had apparently solved the mystery of the voices even before he arrived at Enfield, and the diaphragm theory, it seemed, had been his idea rather than Rose's, but she had agreed to it. "There's been quite a bit of internal strife in the Mirror about the story," Rimmer told me. One hint of fraud and it's out. Having worked for newspapers myself, I had a good idea what had probably happened. Editors, I knew, often tended to be either highly sympathetic towards the paranormal or else highly hostile. I guessed that there was one of each type of editor at the Mirror, and neither faction had yet won out. Rimmer was caught in the crossfire. Whose idea was it to bring Ray Allen, I asked. Oh, that was Clifford Davis's. And who's he? One of our TV critics. He's a magician as well. Something sounded wrong to me. What were all these magicians and TV critics up to? As soon as I had finished talking to Rimmer, Gross decided to go straight to Enfield and find out. There, he found a very distressed Harper family and a furious Peggy Nottingham. Their version of the previous evening's events was more detailed than Rimmer's. They had all had a busy day. A team from BBC Scottish TV had been filming all day in the house. Gross and I had taken part, being filmed talking to Janet's voice, which was in great form. And although the Scots, headed by producer David Martin, were very pleasant and considerate, it was tiring work. Gross and I had left at 7 p.m. Gross now turned on his tape recorder and asked Mrs. Harper what happened next. It must have been around 8 o'clock, she said. There was a knock on the door. My brother John opened the door, and they all came trooping in. I wasn't expecting anybody. I wasn't even told. There were, she said, 5 of them. Brian Rimmer, Graham Morris, Ray Allen, Clifford Davis, and Mr. Bentley. I stood in the middle of the floor, Mrs. Harper continued, and said, I take it you're from the Mirror? And they just looked at me. The 5 men, according to her, chatted among themselves, apparently having no time for the niceties of a social visit, and Ray Allen then went into the kitchen where Rose was finishing her supper. Gross asked for her version of what Allen had said to her. He was saying, I don't know what he was saying, Rose began, then she started to cry. Even nearly 24 hours after the event, she was plainly still thoroughly upset. He was just saying things like, I didn't understand, she went on between sniffs. All those silly words. I was just daydreaming, thinking about what I need for school tomorrow. I wasn't listening to him at all. And I'm going like this, nodding. I'd often noticed Rose do this. She had a way of giving the impression she understood what you were saying even when she clearly did not. He says, said Gross, that you had said you faked the voices with Janet. No, I did not say that, Rose replied indignantly, even if I was nodding, because I wasn't listening to a word he was saying. I thought, oh, sod you. Gross pressed her patiently for details of what Allen had actually said to her. One thing I did understand, said Rose. He said, it's like Father Christmas on his sledge going across the sky. That's not true, just like you two getting together and doing make-believe things. What did he mean by that? Gross asked. I haven't a clue, Rose replied. It was fairly clear to Gross that Rose had not intended to confess anything to anybody. Then he turned to Janet. I didn't say anything, said Janet with her usual directness. They didn't even ask me, and I haven't faked the voice anyway. Peggy Nottingham then told Gross that Janet and Rose had come to see her while the Mirror men were still in their house. They came rushing in all crying their eyes out, she said. He upset them because he was just like a bully. He really just said to at them. They didn't have a chance to explain a thing. She was not referring to Ray Allen, she explained, but to Mr. Bentley, who had then come to see her himself, carrying some of Graham Morris's earlier photographs, including the sequence showing the pillows in flight. He said to me, Peggy went on, I'll leave these photos with you, and would you try to get it out of them that one of them threw the pillows? Peggy recalled some further conversation between herself and Mr. Bentley, which I cannot repeat here as it was, as she told it, highly defamatory to him. She made it clear to Gross that she was absolutely disgusted at what she understood as an attempt to pressure her into betraying her neighbors. She also said that she had pointed out to Mr. Bentley that in the first photo, 2 pillows were in flight, yet both girls' hands were under the sheets. The following day, I went along to Gross's office to listen to the taped interview mentioned above. He was almost as upset as the people at Enfield by the whole affair, and was in the blackest mood I had ever seen him in. When I had finished listening to Peggy Nottingham's statement, I grabbed his phone, called Brian Rimmer, and gave him a fair-sized piece of my mind. I could not believe Rimmer had been responsible for this episode. He had always been polite and sociable with the Harpers, and he had researched his story very thoroughly and objectively. After telling him what I thought of the previous day's events, I assured him that I was still interested in getting to the truth of the case, as I felt he also was, and that one way we might succeed in doing this was through hypnosis. I had been very impressed by Dr. Fletcher's single session with Janet, which I described in Chapter 9. I had really felt that we were getting somewhere, and if we had been able to follow up that session, who knows what might have emerged. But I also knew enough about hypnotism to be well aware of the dangers of its misuse, so I insisted that any further hypnotizing must be done by Dr. Fletcher and by nobody else. Rimmer agreed and immediately offered to make all the necessary arrangements if I could persuade Dr. Fletcher to do the job, and persuade Janet to let him hypnotize her again. I knew this would not be easy, but it was worth trying. However, once again we had bad luck. Dr. Fletcher was on the eve of a professional trip abroad and simply did not have a spare minute. Rimmer did manage to have a word with him before he left the country, and in the article to be mentioned in the following chapter, he quoted him as stating, "On the evidence I have, I cannot believe this case is a fraud." So once again, Gross and I found ourselves at a dead end. We just could not find the right person at the right time, a problem that had beset us throughout the case. At this point, Maurice Gross set off for 2 weeks' well-earned holiday, while I stayed away from Enfield to see what effect our joint absence might have, and apparently had none at all. The day after Gross's departure, there was knocking all over the place, 2 chairs fell over, a plant hopped off the kitchen sill into the sink, the sofa cushions slid to either end and stood upright, A box of paper tissues moved on its own, and a puddle of liquid and 2 lots of excrement were found on the floor. A pile of ice cubes also turned up on the kitchen floor, though none were missing from the fridge. Janet's voice then announced that they had come from next door, but none were missing from Peggy's fridge either. And one day a most elaborate construction appeared. On the kitchen table there were 2 cups, a glass, the sugar tin, the tea caddy, the butter dish, a flannel, and a dishcloth all piled on top of each other. The voice proudly announced that "I done that," but gave no further information. I paid just one visit to Enfield while Gross was away. Together with Dr. Fletcher, after he had returned from his trip, I decided to go ahead with a hypnosis session on my own without telling the mirror. Unfortunately, Janet was in one of her most uncooperative moods and firmly refused to be hypnotized again, though Dr. Fletcher did manage to have a long talk with her alone. Just before this, while we were all in the living room, I went into the kitchen on my way to the toilet to find that a flower pot had moved from the windowsill into the sink, just as reported previously, and the tap had been turned on above it. I was fairly sure that nobody had been into the kitchen since I had last seen it, but neither Dr. Fletcher nor I could be certain, and it had to be one of the times I did not have my recorder running. When Gross came back from his holiday, we set about preparing our symposium for the second international conference organized by the SPR in Cambridge, which was held in the last week of March 1978. Cambridge was the right place for such a conference, for it had been there nearly 100 years ago that the SPR had come into being. It had happened one evening as Frederick Myers, a bright young classical scholar, and Professor Henry Sidgwick strolled along the beautiful stretch beside the River Cam known as the Backs. Myers made the suggestion, and in 1882 the SPR came into being, with Sidgwick as its first president. An hour before our symposium, I took a stroll on my own along the Backs in homage to Myers, who was to become the outstanding psychical researcher of all time. It was only my second visit to Cambridge since my graduation 20 years previously, and many pleasant memories of undergraduate life came back. I stood and looked at the magnificent Wren Library of Trinity College, where Myers' private papers were kept, records of many earlier battles with unseen forces. Then a blast of damp Cambridge air made me shiver and reminded me why I had emigrated to Brazil. Our symposium took place in the austere Divinity Building, and we had a good crowd of more than 100. I spotted Professor Hans Bender from West Germany, the leading European authority on poltergeists, and Professor Archie Roy from Glasgow, who had just been investigating a case similar in many ways to ours. The conference had so far been pretty boring, with paper after paper on laboratory experiments that were duller than any lectures I had sat through as an undergraduate. Gross and I decided we would try and liven things up. Gross kicked off with a very concise and factual account of the case to date, summarizing the types of phenomenon we had observed or recorded from eyewitnesses under 17 headings. These included knocks, movement of small and large objects, interference with bedclothes, appearance of water, apparitions, levitation of persons, physical assaults of several types, automatisms, psychological disturbance, equipment malfunction and failure, the passage of matter through matter, unidentifiable voice phenomenon both embodied and disembodied, and spontaneous combustion. While he was reeling off this list, I looked around the audience. Some, like Professor Bender, were listening intently, while elsewhere I saw a number of raised eyebrows. Clearly, this was a bit much for some SPR members who had never witnessed anything paranormal all their lives. Anticipating this reaction, we each provided a list of incidents we had actually seen ourselves. We had selected our lists very carefully, and included only those for which neither of us could suggest a normal explanation. The recent episode of the flower pot in the kitchen did not meet our standards, for I could not be sure nobody had been in the kitchen after I had seen the pot in its normal place. Gross told the audience that he had seen marbles and other objects in high-speed transit at inexplicably high velocities and in unusual trajectories. He had seen a teapot wobble on its own, slippers, pillows, doors, drawers, the carpet, the door chimes, and a paper handkerchief moving without evident physical causation. He had seen a lampshade tilt by itself and a cardboard box flung right in his face. The sports certificate had shot off the wall behind him, and the sofa had overturned right in front of his eyes. Janet had been thrown out of a chair also in front of his eyes, together with the cushion she had been sitting on, and John Burkham had been whirled out of his chair and dumped on the floor. He had frequently heard footsteps and sounds of doors opening or closing when there was nobody present at the site in question. He had seen a coin fall directly from the ceiling. He had heard numerous knocks, which had responded intelligently to questions. And of course, he had heard the controversial voice. There had also been a number of incidents that he had not seen take place, such as the fires and appearance of water, but that he could not regard as having been normally caused. He emphasized that there were 2 types of conviction, intellectual and emotional. While we can be intellectually satisfied that an event has taken place, he explained, we cannot experience emotional conviction unless we see something for ourselves. Each of us can state with confidence that he is emotionally convinced that inexplicable events have occurred at Enfield. I then added my list. I had seen an armchair overturn while the only person near it was in my full view. I had heard the kitchen table overturn while the only people in the room were visibly nowhere near it. I had seen a slipper pass over a door and appear downstairs on the doormat after a thorough search of the spot where it could have been expected to land. My own notebook had jumped off the bed right under my nose and moved towards the only person within reach of it who had not moved at all. I had heard several instances of seemingly intelligent knocking and had limited communication with the source even when out of earshot of the family, and I had been present at all stages of the development of the voice, which I could not consider to be normal. I also described the incident of the book flying out of one room, hitting a door, and being found by me within seconds standing upright in the other room, indicating a wholly inexplicable trajectory. I then gave an account of our research methods and equipment used, emphasizing that we had already recorded 6 hours of testimony from eyewitnesses and some 140 hours of live action in the house, which included immediate descriptions of many of the incidents we had just listed. I then read out our joint conclusions, which I will condense here. The Enfield case seems to have come to us straight from the textbook. It has offered almost every feature of traditional poltergeist cases and has lasted more than twice as long as the average. We were able to investigate it from within a week of the onset and believe that a detailed study of it will contribute to the eventual understanding of a phenomenon that causes much distress and therefore deserves to be researched as thoroughly as any physical or mental illness. I summarized the two leading theories as to what poltergeists really are: spirits of the dead or disassociated fragments of the personality or consciousness of the focus person, in this case Janet. I insisted that while there was good reason to support either view, the truth probably lay in a combination of the two. Poltergeists certainly acted as if they were spirits or individual entities possessing some kind of intelligence, but on the other hand, the close connection with the personality of the focus person was often very striking. I mentioned the episodes that had accompanied Janet's menage, and her voice harping on the question of why girls have periods is a clear example of this connection. I felt like adding that we had tried hard to get help from psychologists and psychiatrists on this aspect of the case, and it completely failed. The 4 SPR member psychologists who had been to Enfield having told us nothing at all. But since all 4 were at the conference, I decided to let that wait. We will end with a strong call for further investigation of the poltergeists, I concluded, chiefly by psychologists and physicists, for here we have what appears to be a unique opportunity to study the interactions between mind and matter, a relationship that has intrigued man since the earliest days of recorded knowledge. When we have learned the true nature of poltergeist activity, we can then turn the mechanisms involved to more useful ends. This research must be interdisciplinary, and it must be adequately financed. There is a limited amount of work that volunteer part-time researchers such as ourselves can achieve. We will ask members to help us draw up plans for the final attack on an area of human experience that remains unexplored far too long. We then played selections from our tapes, and the somber Divinity Hall reverberated to sounds I am sure it had not heard before. We had picked some of our best incidents, including the whole of the sequence in which the cardboard box had been thrown in Gross's face, and the one in which Janet had been dragged out of bed and halfway downstairs. This was way too much for one member, who interrupted Gross's commentary with, "Excuse me, where was Rose when Janet went out of the door?" "She was in the bed," Gross replied. I then drew a plan on the blackboard showing Janet's approximate movement, making it clear that if Rose had opened the door, she would have had to get right out of bed. Moreover, there was not room at the doorway for 2 people, as the door almost touched Rose's headboard when opened. And did he really think Mrs. Harper would not have seen her? This did not satisfy our colleague. "She could quite easily have opened the door," he insisted. Gross replied that she was asleep. "How do you know she was asleep?" "Oh my god," I thought. Why couldn't he wait for question time like everybody else? I saw the argument going on all night. He had just heard Mrs. Harper state no less than 10 times on the tape that the door had opened by itself. What more did he want? We managed to get on with our lecture without further interruption, and Professor Hasted then gave a brief and precise account of the results of his study of the tapes recorded during the laryngograph experiment. I listened eagerly, for the results were new to me. The voice, Professor Hasted said, was being produced by the false vocal folds and not by the standard vocal cords. These false folds are a kind of auxiliary apparatus that protects the trachea from invading impurities. "This is a speech effect known as plica ventricularis," he explained, and normally it cannot be done by people without great effort. It gives them a sore throat in 1 or 2 minutes, because there isn't sufficient liquid to lubricate the false vocal folds, so they get inflamed more quickly. Professor Hasted then showed a single slide showing the waveforms both of Janet's normal voice and of her deep voice, which were strikingly different. When I later questioned Professor Forson on the voice, he was not prepared to state that the production of the voice was in itself inexplicable. Children, he assured me, can make extraordinary noises, and our lubrication systems can vary widely. Strictly speaking, therefore, I cannot claim the voice to be paranormal in itself. What Gross and I continue to find inexplicable is the fact that the 2 girls were able to impersonate old men convincingly over a long period, and Professor Forson admits that this question lies beyond his field of specialized knowledge. Finally, we came to discussion and question time. Professor Roy, at my request, gave an account of his Scottish poltergeist case, which had almost all the features of ours, including a brief sample of similar-sounding deep voices. The only feature of our case that most members seemed to want to ask questions about was what they insisted on calling fraud. Although Anita Gregory kindly pointed out that this was quite the wrong word in this context, since it implied deliberate deceit for commercial gain. There could certainly be no question of that at Enfield. As one member after another droned on, airing his or her private obsessions, I became thoroughly fed up. Fraud, I assured the audience, was the first matter Gross and I had gone into on the case, and we had totally eliminated it as an explanation for the case. We had spelled out no less than 26 incidents for which no kind of fraud hypothesis could account. Was that not enough? Apparently not. For one member demanded to know exactly how many of the incidents, which we could cautiously estimate to have reached 1,500 by the end of March 1978, had been observed by outside witnesses. I told him I had no idea and invited him to tell me how exactly we could be expected to record precise details when things were happening faster than we could write them down, as had often been the case. Some of you people, I declared at one point in the ensuing discussion, won't accept the fact that the phenomenon this society was founded to investigate actually do exist. I don't know why you're in the society at all. We had presented, I thought, a precise and detailed account of a very remarkable case, one that deserved to be studied as a whole rather than as a mere string of separate incidents. Yet the reaction of one questioner after another was entirely negative. All they were interested in was fraud and statistics. I managed to bring the meeting to an end by reminding the chairman that the pubs were going to close. We had been on the platform for exactly 2 hours, and all I could think of was a pint of good Cambridge bitter. Luckily, the chairman sympathized with me. Well, I said to Maurice Gross as we drove back to London, what did you make of it all? We certainly stirred things up, at least. I think there's a lot of fear involved, especially among the academics, he replied. You see, we're threatening their security by presenting them with facts they can't explain, so they refuse to admit the facts, although thousands of cases similar to ours have been recorded all over the world for centuries. Maurice was still on the lecture platform, well warmed to his subject. This refusal, he went on, might seem at first to be a sensible approach to a difficult subject, but how does this kind of logic apply to other sciences? Take psychology, where accepted theories often have little to recommend them when tested in practice, or astronomy, where established theories on the origin and form of the universe are overturned almost every day. And how about neurology? We know almost nothing about the real nature of the brain and its relation to the mind, yet the brain surgeon is still ready to chop it about, not always with very nice results. Geneticists can tell us a lot about how the genes operate and about the amazing workings of the DNA molecule, but what do they know about the control that makes it all work? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? I interrupted. That's T.S. Eliot, you know. The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries have brought us farther from God and near to the dust. And he said that 40 years ago, before the age of fallout. How right he was too, Maurice replied. Everybody is busy nowadays working on the mechanics of this or that scientific problem, but who is interested in the great thought, order, and rule that make everything conform? I know philosophical contemplation is out of fashion nowadays, but I think it's the lack of it that leads to materialism, which in turn leads to skepticism. And that leads nowhere, as we've just seen. It led me to the bar in a hurry, I said, but I know what you mean. Go on. Now, take our problem, said Maurice. Poltergeist activity is a syndrome or a coming together of separate events to form a collective event. Each of those events needs studying by a different kind of specialist, but the trouble with some of our colleagues is that in parapsychology or psychical research, too many experts bring their expertise to bear on just one aspect of the subject. They can tell us quite a lot about the trees, but nothing about the forest. We drove on in silence. Maurice's words reminded me of a passage from one of the books written in automatic writing by the Brazilian spiritist medium Chico Xavier, and as soon as I got home I looked it up. Researchers, currently known as metaphysicists, are strange workers who swarm all over the field of service without producing anything fundamentally useful. They bend over the soil, they count grains of sand and invading worms, they calculate the temperature, and they study longitude, climatic conditions, and atmospheric variations. But they forgot about the seed.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real. Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.